Hey, how's it going, everybody? I'm Ben from Universal Audio, and welcome to another UAD Office Hours. If you've been watching our channel for the last couple months, you probably are used to seeing Luna Office Hours, but this week is a little bit different because we have just released the Neve 1084 plugin for UAD. Obviously, it works great in Luna, but it also works in all major workstations: Pro Tools, Ableton. You can load it up in Console or Logic. It doesn't matter. It's an incredibly smooth and just rich EQ, great sounding preamp. And I could just sit here and talk about it all day long, but that would probably get really boring really fast. So instead, just like we did yesterday, we were bringing along some incredible talent. And this morning, I'm joined by the one and only Damian Taylor. How's it going, man?
Good, man. How are you?
Doing well, thanks.
Oh, goodness. It's a lovely day here, and we've been discussing off stream that it's been a profoundly stressful morning for me of computer crashes, but it's all come together in the end. So
Isn't it great that, like, you think it's a computer would just work reliably at all points in time, but no, they have
well,
minds of their own.
especially when it was working fine when you went to bed.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. But you know that there's that whole saying about like we learn from our failures,
Hmm.
and certainly I've learned from enough computer crashes over the years to be able to get it up and running again. But it was an intense one. Yeah.
Yeah, for real.
Yeah.
Well, man, so you're based down in LA at the moment, right?
I'm in LA these days. Yeah, I'm originally Canadian.
Hmm.
Spent my teenage years in New Zealand, and I came through the studio system in London in the UK. So my parents
Nice.
are British as well. So I kind of identify as a Britophile, kind of.
Uh-huh.
But as soon as I land in the UK, everyone thinks I'm American. But yeah, long story short, after 10 years in the UK, then I did 7 years in Montreal. Like I needed some California sunshine.
Yeah.
And feeling very lucky at the moment because I found one of those LA houses where one of the rooms was converted to what was formerly actually a mastering suite.
Okay.
So while we're all in lockdown, I'm really lucky that I get to keep working in my usual room and everything. So
Hmm.
feeling
Well,
feeling
and
good.
you've not only been busy working, but you've added on things to do during the quarantine. You've been streaming as well, sir.
Yeah. Well, it's funny. I was thinking about this a lot before COVID kicked in, which is that we're all, not all of us, but a lot of us are just in a room in our houses or in our own kind of independent facility, kind of working away and creating stuff. And I missed, the my London experience of working in big multi-studio rooms.
Hmm.
So I was trying to think, like, how can I start sharing a bunch of this stuff I'm doing? How can I have a lot of the conversations we'd used to have where, you'd pop into each other's studio and sit on each other's sofas. And sometimes you get a tip and a trick. And sometimes it's just like you watch someone working and say, what are you doing?
Hmm.
So long story short, I'm now streaming on Twitch every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday morning.
Nice.
Some days I'm doing stuff like just making dub edits of songs. Some days I'm having artists on and like really having kind of deep and meaningful conversations with them. Other days I'm wrapping up mixes. Some days I'm programming beats. So it's a little bit of kind of whatever's coming in,
Hmm.
but it's been really, really fun. Like kind of getting some friends from all over the world coming in and, starting to send me parts for stuff I'm working on just off the cuff. And, that's been really cool. So it's still very early days,
Yeah.
but it's bubbling up. And then, I was mentioning I was up late last night thinking it would be amazing to share something very cool with our viewers today.
Hmm.
And I've developed this system of saving your sanity through this like STEM printing methodology in Pro Tools, which I've talked to quite a few friends and no one else is doing.
Hmm.
So that's almost ready.
Yeah.
But if anyone wants to follow me on the socials, I'm just basically here as Damien with a Damian on Instagram and Twitter, and same on twitch.tv/here as Damien. Once that's ready, should be in a couple of days, then you can start kind of working in the studio while also making dinner
Yeah.
and making all your relationships better. But
Isn't
yeah,
that,
and
isn't
then
that
I'm
like the ultimate goal, right? To be able to just like hit a button and walk away and let it
yeah,
take care of
yeah.
everything.
And I mean, it's funny, like in so many platforms, that stuff almost works.
Hmm.
If you know what I mean, it's always just that like final little almost detail. So I did a lot of thinking about like where are the points where the human error normally happens. And, I
Yeah.
do a lot of this weird kind of meta thinking of where is my brain and my ability to pay attention and handle details, the major limiting factor in a step in the process.
Hmm.
So this whole STEM printing system, I can't believe we're starting by talking about computers and STEM printing. But yeah, that whole system, it's basically acknowledges that we start getting really tired and we start making mistakes. So it kind of batches all of your thinking together in one part. And then you
Hmm.
can hit a button on Pro Tools and, like the song that I had laid out to STEM and mix print was like 2 hours of processing time.
Hmm.
And there's nothing better than going and making dinner or watching a movie while you're working because
Yep.
something is actually happening. And critically as well, like, you know, if I'm doing independent projects that are lower budgets for mixing, if people do need stems, that still ties up my studio. So we normally charge by the hour for that.
Hmm.
But this cuts down on so much human time and human error that it's also like a way more cost-effective way to do it for clients. So
Nice.
yeah. So if anyone out there is like delivering a lot of mixes and stems, follow me on the socials.
Yeah.
Here
I
is Damian,
know. I know.
and
I'm gonna.
I'll let you know when that's live.
I was like, I know I'm going to be watching that for sure when it comes out.
Yeah.
Is
But
it,
that's also the first one I made. So actually, I was recording the final segment last night and
Mhm.
didn't realize the camera wasn't on for half an hour. So
We've
again,
been
we
there.
learn from our mistakes, and I'm making them all so you don't have to.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Oh man, that's funny. Well, yeah, I mean, this this is the kind of show where we start off with computer and streaming and nerding
yeah.
out about stems, but the kind of the host of the hour here is the Neve 1084 plugin.
Yes.
So have you had experiences with the hardware version of the 1084?
I've used a ton of Neve pre's. I haven't been in. No, I mean, hang on, let me think this through. I almost feel like anytime I've recorded on Neve consoles, I've never noted the exact model number.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, you
And
see the
it's
red
like,
knob, you turn,
yeah,
and
and
whatever
it's like,
EQ you're happy with.
and it's like, hang on, well, was that the different 1080 something that had the 4 bands of EQ?
Uh-huh.
Because I did a bunch on those. But yeah, so I've been enough in the world of the big clunky things with like the step frequencies and everything to know what's going on.
Yeah.
And and basically I always record with a Neve circuit.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense. And
Yeah.
there's a lot of them out there,
Uh-huh.
but those are just the ones that work. And so, as well as the EQ side, it's just like what that preamp does at various settings is a gorgeous thing.
Yeah. And so
Yeah.
what do to someone who's kind of newer to recording, how would you describe it to them? Like just how would you say, hey, here's the Neve sound and here's why you should be using it on almost everything?
So I know that we get into like a lot of superlatives in pro audio, but I honestly think the best thing that I can say about it is it sounds like music.
Mm.
Do you know what I mean? Like it doesn't mess up what I'm recording.
Yeah.
So like you can say like, oh yes, deep, warm, fat, wide, good.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's much more like when I'm using other stuff. I mean, there's a certain level of like stuff that's great, but with the Neve stuff in general, I'll notice more on other things when it's messing up what I want to capture.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And the
Mhm.
Neve stuff basically never messes it up.
Yeah. Well, and the musical part of it, like that is probably it's the best superlative to use for the Neve stuff is like
Yeah.
the preamp, the gain staging, the way it the kind of the color it can add is musical, but then you get into the EQ part of it, and that's where like
Yeah.
the musicality jumps even more forward of like those frequencies aren't just picked on accident, like they were picked
Yeah.
because after decades of tuning and figuring out what's useful and what sounds the best on the most amount of sources, that's kind of how they've arrived at what those EQs are able to do.
Yeah, and actually, I'm having a flashback now. I think the first proper recording session I did on a lovely old Neve was at, I think it was called, was it 2 kilohertz in East London? I think the 10cc guys owned it. I might be confusing it with one in West London.
Mhm.
But anyways, on a session with Jim Abbas producing, and I just remember going like, oh, all of them sound good. And that's kind of quite wild, like when you're just like, oh, that works. But then there's also even the fact that there's a limited number of choices.
Yeah.
So you go, do I want this good, or this good? And you go, want. So it's just like very fast as well. It's there. It's a very, I want to say it's a very specific tool. I don't know if that's quite the right word because you can use it in so many situations, but the way those EQs work is fantastic for like really broad stuff.
Mhm.
But I've found it really interesting actually with the new plugin you guys have done and with the presets that I've designed, because I got to mess around with a lot of stuff that I wouldn't normally do in a tracking situation.
Oh, really?
If you know what I mean. And like really approaching it from like, I mean, you guys have so many brilliant, like proper recording engineers in the Universal Audio family. Do you know what I mean? Like yesterday, it's Joe Ciccarelli and Jimmy Douglas. Like, do you know what I mean? And so I kind of feel a bit like I have to kind of represent the weird kids who grew up on computers and, sampled weird records and that kind of stuff. So I was really interested to see how this one would work and your version would work as like a real kind of harmonic and color processing machine as well.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the I'm really finding that it's an incredible way of, it's a very creative device, which I'm quite surprised about because always in tracking situations, like I was saying before, it's like I love Neve stuff because it's very forgiving and it doesn't mess stuff up.
Yeah.
But I'm finding in this situation, like, oh, I can like really like rub stuff with like some heavy duty sandpaper,
Uh-huh.
really reshape things in quite an extreme way. But and it's doing stuff that nothing else that I'm using really at the moment is doing as well. Like I have played around quite a lot with other kind of like Neve EQ emulations or plugs that are out there. I have been using the is it the V series channel strip, the kind of the smaller knob one?
Oh, the RS, or sorry, VR. Yeah, the Neve
yeah,
VR
that's the one.
88,
Yeah. And that's, I love what that does in terms of like adding some chunky gain and all that kind of stuff. But it's the kind of the way that you can make some really kind of broad, almost like axe cuts and chisel out some frequencies and then interact that with the input gain and the fader is really, really lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I love too, like we were geeking about this yesterday. It's like, yeah, the way that they modeled all the gain stages of it, both the line input, the mic input, the fact that you can get into the mic gain even after the fact and really blow stuff up, but then you also have an output fader plus a digital trim. So like you're getting all of every gain stage that's available inside the plugin is there. And some people have even pointed out like just engaging the EQ circuit on it and not touching the EQ at all
does a thing.
It does a thing.
Yeah, that's so wonderful. Cool, right? Yeah. And I think like really dialing into those colors. There's actually another plug you guys have, the API Vision strip. And I remember the day I realized like, oh, putting that in and like having the EQ and the dynamics in, and then I'd put like one of your Studer things before it, and you just put those on. Incidentally, I have a preset for that Studer. It's like my D basic Studer setup, but you just put that on everything, and it just does a thing.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. So I love plugs once you start to like really get a sense that even before you start boosting and cutting, they just can add a subtle bit of character that, especially once you spread it across a whole mix. Really lets you kind of embrace the power of digital by designing like a character for your whole mix.
Yeah. I'll just wait till you start getting your hands into Luna, man. You're
okay. I've heard about it. Yeah,
you may have heard some rumors, but
I've heard some rumors.
But it's speaking to exactly what you're talking about here. Of like,
really,
that was kind of the idea behind it, was building in tape. The tape extension is now built into each track, so instead of having to pull up a Studer plugin on each one, you can just put the Studer extension in, pull up your same presets inside of there. And then you can also kind of manage multiple machines together. So you can say, like, great, all my drums and bass are on machine number A with this setup, and I want the guitars and vocals on machine B with this, with this configuration. You can get super granular like that, or you can put them all in one machine like you would in a real, it emulates that real world workflow of like, normally you'd be running a tape machine and everything's getting played back off of that same formula and the same speed and everything. And then on top of that we've got Neve summing added into the buses as well, again for like that kind of subtle, just what a console does to kind of help sounds come together.
Great.
So yeah, I know you're busy and you got lots of you already have plenty of things on your plate to do.
I'll add it to the list.
Definitely. Exactly. Add that. Have to add that one to your list in a little bit. But let's actually. Do you mind? I know you did manage to pull up some great examples for us to check out today.
Eventually, it worked. Yeah.
Right?
So we do have some set up. Shall we dive into something?
Let's do it. Yeah. Let's we can sit here and just talk and use superlatives all day, but it'd be a lot more fun, I think, to.
All right. So I'm gonna press a button here. So y'all should be seeing. This is basically. I thought this would be a fun one to open up. This is like a track I wrapped up with a friend a while ago, and I knew I needed to open it up and give it like a little repolish. So I'll just run you guys a verse just to hear what's going on.
Here you come around again. Talk about the worst of sin. Got me lost in my head with the weight of what you said.
All right, and I'll run you a little bit of chorus because I'll actually give you some chorus too with a bunch of harmonies. So this is like a bit of a deep, long track, but let's talk about straight off something a little bit more extreme. but not too extreme. As this plug is out in the world, right? People can get it.
Yep, it is out as no longer top secret. You can now show your screen with it.
So if you I think there should be like a little Damian Taylor folder, and there should be one called BV texture. And this basically, if we have this bypass there, it's just a BV layer. Here.
Have faith in me, baby. No, I don't need
So this is my friend Rachel Cantu. She's got like really beautiful kind of clean voice, but I'm always interested in ways to like give us an interesting mid-range texture. If we pop this on.
Faith in me, baby. No, I don't need saving. I feel you waiting like you think of.
So what we're doing is, like you were mentioning earlier, we're using the actual switching, bumping it over so that we're getting just a tiny little bit of grit out of the mic pre. I wouldn't even, I'm struggling to know quite what the adjective is, but we're just getting some, we're getting some finger rubbing.
Yeah. Exactly. You're adding a little bite, a little extra kind of hair, I guess, on the sound.
Yeah, or it's like kind of just searing your ahi tuna before you put it on the salad kind of thing. And this is also like, these kinds of things are really useful. Let me put it on both layers. If you're also wanting to kind of turn something down, but have it come through more. So like when we were listening to this raw, there's like a lot more kind of fundamental frequencies that's coming through.
Faith in me, baby. No, I don't need saving. I feel you waiting. Like you think I'll just cave in. Have faith in me.
Jump through a lot more, and it's like, so that's a pretty nice like subtle example of example of a more extreme textural approach. So we're like digging in, bringing out harmonics without just like, it's not just that we're affecting a frequency balance there. So that's doing a little something.
Well,
and
it's nice too, because you're not just blowing it out, which is, there's sometimes, even I've done this myself, using that trick of kind of moving it over into the mic gain. You can overcook it pretty easily, but what you're doing there with like having that crazy amount of high pass and kind of you're taming it down in the right way, so you're right, it's jumping forward and it's kind of surrounding that lead vocal, so they're sticking out, but they're not kind of overtaking in a great way.
And then especially on a track like this, where you like want to have a lot of room in kind of like the low mids to let like the kick and bass feel like nice and boomy without being overly squished. You got to be really careful with what your fundamental frequencies are doing.
Yeah.
And little pro tip as well, like I have this right at the end of the chain. So I have like an LA2A earlier on that's doing a bunch of squeezing and a couple of other stages of compression. So it's really interesting experiment. Actually, should we just try this right now? I don't know how the hell this is going to sound. But if we put it at the start of the chain before any dynamics, let me switch this back on. Then let's see how that sounds different. If it does. Versus popping it at the end. Versus early again. So when it's at the end, it's a subtle difference, but you're kind of presenting like a much more even dynamic input, so the kind of harmonics can be a lot more consistent.
Yeah. Well, I heard that instantly, because like you heard like a couple of the words when you had it earlier in the chain, they kind of popped over into that like slightly, a little too seared, if you will, like on a few words, whereas
burnt it's called.
Yeah, exactly. Had some burnt ends with it there in the earlier part of the chain, and then at the later part of the chain, you're right, it was just like you're getting that tone the whole time, but just a consistency to the color.
Yeah, actually, a good friend of mine, Tom Monahan, really like got me thinking about how few tools we have that can go like consistently from totally clean all the way to like fuzz. So when you have stuff where you can really control that entire range in like one device, it becomes like immensely creative in terms of what you can do.
Yeah.
Let's look at something that's like very much in this world. Actually, I know. I want to come back and like look at some drums and subs, but just while I'm kind of thinking in that way, this is actually some acoustic guitars from a totally different song. Because we're all a little bit scattered these days. So here's these guys kind of straight. Let me bump those up. All right, it's all like pretty nice and clean and warm and classic and everything. We pop these in. These are actually like in quick side story, like I designed all my presets in a record that's not out yet, so I couldn't pull up that record unfortunately and go through literally all these presets. But these are kind of designed to work on like an electronic track.
Yeah.
So basically there's going to be all these things that are like totally banging around it, but I want these guitars to like give us like a rich mid-range without, again, just like with the BVs, we're dealing with that same frequency range where we want to give some stuff some vibe, without chewing up the physics of like the foundation of the track. So so this little setting here is, again, similar kind of mic pre-range, just around like the 20-30 kind of zone. And similar tricks of like this, I'm using like more of a low shelf that's higher up, cutting some stuff out, boosting some highs, but then also using the low mid parametric. Sorry, not parametric. Semi-parametric. Anyway, the mid frequency lower down to pull some stuff out. So we're basically pulling out boom, but again, just opening up the mic pre a bit, just kind of sizzle things a bit. Here we go. So that versus that. Yeah. And okay, yeah, the purists will say, but Damian, that's louder, to which I'd say, you're right. But you know, this is kind of where we wound up.
Also notice how it sounds a lot better. Like you get so much more of the string, you get so much more of the steel character kind of coming through. And like you mentioned, if this is going on top of a cacophony of bass and synths and other things, like what purpose would an acoustic guitar kind of or any element like this kind of fit in that mix? It's all about that brightness and that kind of like that detail and clarity.
Yeah, totally. And that's a really good point about like all the steel stuff. So that kind of drives the rhythm forward a lot more. So we're able to kind of like pick out it's obviously doing an arpeggiated thing. And when you're marrying that with electronics, what do we do in electronics in the new millennium? We put things through arpeggios. So it's kind of letting, just melding the two worlds together a little bit more. So it's a little bit kind of it goes from being very natural sounding to being a bit hyped or a bit unreal or something. But also one might think it's a bit cooler. So shall we we're talking about like program music, so we're gonna have to check out some beats, right? Why don't I jump over to let me jump to the end of the track actually, or towards the end, and I'll solo up some chorus drums, and maybe there's a bit of a sub bass that comes in. Mute these vocals. I love wonky beats and I love things to sound a bit weird and kind of clangy. But what is not happening here, I've not dialed anything in yet, but there's some kind of like mid-rangey, percussion-y, textury things. Is that clunky? It's been a bit since I've seen this. Yeah, those guys, it'd be way cooler to have them coming through.
Yeah.
So why don't we turn this up here? And we'll whack a 1084 in here. And is there a Damian Taylor preset already? You know what? I'm going to start with the BV texture. And let's pull down this fader a bit. Let's crank that up. We're getting a bit too much of kind of the top endy stuff, but we want a bit more. Yeah, so here now we're getting like a lot of the kind of weird chewy stuff and like the wonky stuff is coming out. And this is without that on there. And that's with it on. All right. And the other thing you might be saying is, Damian, I noticed you have your bass in there, but I'm not hearing it.
I was about to say that to you.
Yeah.
It's like you say there's a bass, but where's my bass?
Totally. And I'd say, my friend, you are right. So let's rectify that, right? But what I do know is, because this mix I put together on like the big system in this room with like a 12-inch sub, and it's all like flat down to whatever. So I know that the sub is in there. And if we just go turning up our sub, as everyone knows, our whole mix is going to start falling over because the sub will come in and then everything else will get really quiet. Yeah, exactly.
Just pushes everything back.
Totally. And Ben, you would doubtless agree that we don't want that, right?
No, every time I've sent in a mix with that, I've gotten the note back of great. How about less bass, Ben?
Totally. Yeah. All right. So we're going to do the same. We're going to pop it on there. Now, this is, I'm going to start with this like completely flat. I think I have a preset in there called, sub bass parallel fizz.
Mm-hmm.
And that gives your sub bass some parallel fizz. All right, in case you're in doubt what it does.
You're
But
so good at these names too.
so good with the names.
Great presets and great naming of the presets. I love it.
So let's just basically build into that from scratch and kind of see the different ranges that we can get from here. So all my headphones are getting at the moment is like a little bit of air moving. I'm hearing a bit of attack.
Mm-hmm.
Let's pull down our fader here. I'm going to crank this. Oops, crank that over there. So that's gone into kind of parody territory already.
Uh-huh.
Let's pull that back a little bit. Okay, so see there, we're just starting to get like a little bit of, it's kind of talking to us on the top end, but now I'm going to knock all the low end out with a shelf. Actually, this is a, you might think, oh, you should high pass, but there are arguments by people with slide rulers, which would say sometimes when you're working with paralleling low end stuff, a high pass filter will do stuff to the phase that is weird.
Yeah.
So I'm finding increasing actually like using more extreme kind of low shelving cuts for parallels on like drums and stuff are working a bit better. So they might still have a little bit of low end in there, but it kind of marries up better with a musical range. Anyway, let's keep going on this one. So I'm going to bring this up a bit. All right. So we can hear that the attack is starting to feel pretty good now, but we're losing the tail. So why don't we go and whack on, actually one of my favorite plugs is the very new.
Nice. Well, and I do love the way it's fizzing out on it though, too.
And that, I gotta say, like, I've spent a lot of time searching for things that do that kind of bright, clear top end distortion, because there's a ton of things where it tends to almost get a bit woolly. Yep. Or like it gets super warm. And the way that the top end of this plug actually kind of crackles is really, really, really lovely. So I'm just gonna, we'll take off our high pass sidechain filter, right? Yep. So that's now doing a big boom there. We're gonna just turn that up a little bit on the output. So now here it's kind of like purring a lot more right to the end of the tail. And what's happening here? I'm just going to try this one little click back. Try one click back again. So see, that's like a little bit more. So let's try it about there. And I'm just going to see if there's anything cool in there. So let's bring up some top end. And now let's do our soloing BS and beats again. Whoops. Actually, I'm gonna turn that one down first as well. All right, so this is without it, and we'll bring it in. So hear how that's letting our ear find the note in there. And I'm just gonna pull it back a click. I'm just going to nudge this down a bit. Bring this back up. Okay, so that's a little bit strident. I kind of like this, we're not trying to do like a super heavy, intense kind of, noisier bass or anything like that at the moment, but we just want to know that something's going boom. So this is going to just help our ears find it.
Yeah.
And
it's like the number one thing to know about making 808s work on any speaker system, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We think like there's a trick where we think like, oh, it's got so much sub bass, but often things that seem super subby are in a really good musical range. So the fundamental frequency is up at a point where a sound system can reproduce it, but then B, there's other information to allow our brain to find it. And especially with mixing, like spending some time understanding the way that our ears process like transients and information. I think it's something like it takes 70% of our ears processing power, so to speak, to process a transient. So thinking about, I do a ton of really, really in-depth editing, and part of how I get electronic stuff and live stuff to marry up really well is being very aware of how those transients are happening together across time. Then using tools like this where you're kind of able to poke out different aspects of the articulation. And it sounded like we were saying with that acoustic, like letting the kind of the attacky stuff come through, it's pointing the listener's ear towards a different part of the sound and a different part of the character, and then it starts to make your grooves feel different, and it's a wonderfully creative tool. But yeah, sub bass, find the right way to go in parallel. But it's I mean, it sounds so simple, but the way that has that really nice kind of fizz to it, it's actually quite difficult to find, because it's very easy to get stuff that goes into kind of like a big kind of blown out thing, which then starts doing that, like clouding up your low mid, and then like the fundamentals of your vocals and any other instruments can all start getting a bit mushy in there too. While we're in this world, why don't we just have another quick look at so we've done our percussion thing. Almost anytime I design settings for people, I like to have a setting called Grid Up Your Perk. I'm not sure if we've done that on the 1084, but I'm just going to, I think I have a setting on here. There we go. There's a thing here called Now Your E-Kick Owns It. All right, so E being electronic. Now this is like the kick on this is it's a bit of a weird one. But if you got something going on and there's an electronic kick and you just want it to own it, then put this setting on it, and guess what'll happen? Now your E kick owns it. All right. So we put that on. I mean, it's not rocket science, this one, is it? It's like, let's actually do a little switch off there. So we're boosting like really low down there. We're boosting some of the attack. We're boosting some super top end. Like, that is not rocket science, but this does it really well.
It just pulls it forward just a little, adds a little bit more life to it. And I see, even on the gain, you've got like a little 5 dB bump on the line side. So like, it's like, and that's kind of the thing for, I think, people to really get comfortable with, is kind of adding that touch of bite. And like, as we were just showing, like, you can overdo it, you can do that, you can super saturate it, but even just that little bit, like that little 5 dB extra little gain going through the class A kind of circuitry of this, just it adds a little je ne sais quoi to
kind of like it expands it. And actually, I'm having a massive flashback now as well, because your guest who was on yesterday, Jimmy Douglas, when I was a bit younger and very impressionable, like I got to sit in on a session with him. Basically, when I was working with Björk, we went to work with Timbaland, and at that time, for all the classic Timbaland stuff, Jimmy did. And I'd spent most of the previous 7-8 years in the UK with everyone sitting there with basically like a Jimmy Douglas Timbaland mix on an aux input on the console. Anytime we're mixing, it's like, why doesn't it sound that good? How do you get that low end? How do you get that low end? Oh my God. And everyone in the UK, we were just like running around in circles trying to make our stuff sound as good as Jimmy's mixes. And so, once I'd been in the room with them for a couple of days, because Björk works mornings and Timbaland works 2 in the mornings. So we had to wait for a number of days for them just to get in the studio at the same time. And once, it's like, I think Jimmy likes me. I sidled up to him on the console and I was like, Jimmy, how do you get that low end, man? And he just goes, oh, you see this? I just turn up the bass on that. And it was like a Neve console. It was literally just like, that knob there, I just turn it up. I was like, what? But he did actually expand a little bit. It's just like, he's like, this circuit, you just kind of put something into it and you just crank that up a little bit. So this is kind of like the 1073 version of how Jimmy Douglas gets that low end.
That's funny. Well, and it's been so interesting over the last couple of days, like talking with Jimmy and Joe and yourself. Like, you guys it seems like you all have different frequencies on that low that you like. So Jimmy's, if I remember correctly, Jimmy is a big 60 fan. Joe, I believe, was a 110 guy. I've seen a couple of your presets. You're on that 35 game down there.
Sometimes you got to go there. Yeah. I mean, I'll be fair as well. Like, this setting was made on a particular kick drum, and anytime you're out there, if you open up one of these settings, like, tweak a couple of things, I think there's one thing that you sometimes hear people talking about when they're like, oh, I always cut this frequency on drums. And it's like, if it's the same like drum kit in the same room with the same chain all the time, then great. But if you tune a drum differently, then all those frequencies are going to move. Or if you're programming stuff like I do most of my programming in live, and you just like bump things up and down a semitone or two, those frequencies are going to move. The song will affect where the fundamentals of the bass are. So mess it around until it gets good. But yeah,
Well,
on
and
that
that's
one,
and
I
that's
just
such
wanted
a
it to be ridiculous and
exactly. Well, and that's such a strong point too of like, the great asset of having all these presets available to us is like, great, you can kind of browse and get inspired, and maybe you hit something that's like, ooh, actually that's affecting in a way that you react to, but then you got to take that next step and really get in there and try a frequency or two, or try on off, and you never want to just go with oh, I pulled up this preset that said it was good for kicks and it's on my kick, so now my kick is done, moving on. Like, if you don't have that critical, if you don't come at it with like, it's good to get inspired and to kind of browse around and find something that like hits you and you react to, but then you gotta kind of interact with it and kind of and play back with it in a way.
100%. But yeah, it's like I'll fully put my hands up and say sometimes when I'm like not quite too sure what to do, when I'm like, I know something needs to change here, like scrolling, you just get ding, 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 scroll through some stuff.
Yeah.
And especially like when you get a new piece, just, yeah, there's weird things that you go, oh, I had no idea you could get this sound out of this thing. And that kind of process will really help you learn where to go.
Yeah. Do you have any other tricks for learning new plugins and for getting your ear accustomed to new sounds?
I mean, it definitely takes time. Like, I can think of a number of plugs where I didn't really get them sometimes for the first few months, or it's like there's some where there's a particular setting on a particular type of sound that in a particular type of mix does a thing that nothing else does.
Yeah.
But overall, yeah, I mean, I think there's, like we're saying, that the preset roulette is a legitimate thing. I know that we can get a bit snobbish and go like, especially like if we're kind of Western European dudes making synth music, it's like I would never use a preset kind of thing. But I've been like really surprised a lot sometimes just seeing what other people have made with things. But then also, like, if you go and you grab all of these knobs, these virtual knobs, and twist them as far as they go, like nothing is going to break. And if you've already bought it, it's not going to cost you any more money. So like, don't be afraid of some of the extreme settings as well. And I don't think I have any settings that are like in the full on kind of like blown out range, but I did a lot of messing around with that gain, and on those mid-rangey things, the things that are in that kind of minus 20 up to 40, really like felt very cool to me. And then that actually encouraged me to explore the EQ in a way that I've never done on the hardware units, and I've never done on any other emulations. So, thinking about these things as real ripe breeding grounds for exploration. I'm not sure if my quote's on the website or whatever, but my actual like distilled quote was just like, this is actually a profoundly creative harmonic kind of shaping color box.
Yeah.
And that was not at all what I expected when I was sent the plug. So I'm kind of surprised it's now like one of my favorite new distortion units, basically, or harmonic and distortion control units.
It's kind of crazy, right? Because if we were selling it as a preamp and EQ, like you think like, oh, it's a Neve, it's going to be kind of this thick rock box.
Yeah, it's going to be classic rock, and like I'm going to grow out my beard a bit, and like get really kind of regimental about like authentic rock and roll. But it's like, no, this is amazing on like sub bass and weird vocals and clanky percussion and stuff. So
right. Well,
and that's also why I really wanted to represent that side of it here today.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the interesting thing is like you can easily get people can kind of easily pigeonhole certain plugins for certain certain sounds, certain genres, certain areas of their mix. Like you pulled up the very mute earlier. Like I don't know if that's ever ventured away from like a mix bus for me, but. But that's just like this concept I've held of it in my mind, whereas like throwing it on, it's just as good on individual tracks. But
I gotta say, actually, I'm in the similar bus. Like I have it on my mix bus all the time, and I keep having to remind myself like, oh, put it on something else. And every time I do, it's like, whoa, and it does a thing that other things don't do. It's weird. I almost find it does the most like Fairchildy kind of thing that I've found in the box, even though it's they're all different. And I just want to say, like, for the record, for everyone, like I personally, even though like this is a Neve EQ and I've used all the hardware Neve stuff, like I don't personally care whether a plugin sounds exactly like a hardware unit. What I care about is it a useful tool to make music sound great? Do you know what I mean? So it's like all these things. When I say Fairchildy, I just think about like I was working at a studio in Vancouver years ago, and they rolled in like 2 separate Fairchilds, and it was my first time like experiencing that kind of like squishiness and flow.
Yep.
And I hadn't found anything else that could do something in that world really in a way that I liked until I started using Very
Yeah.
right when it came out. So yeah.
And surprise, surprise, it's similar topology. So like it's
Yeah.
similar characteristics, just a different era of technology going into
For
it.
sure. Yeah. And I actually, I wanted to say as well, like I spent a good chunk of years, I don't know if we can see like in a rack down behind me here. I've built like 3 hardware tube LA2A circuits, and I've hand built Neve circuits. And
Yep.
I got really obsessed for a while with hand building analog circuitry. And that was kind of at the point where I was thinking like, I'll need to have a studio for myself. And I was feeling really insecure because I didn't have all the vintage gear. And I was like, and you look on eBay and these things are like $7,000 or whatever. And it's like, but I need one of those to make my vocal sound good. But I also like really wanted to start to address like an understanding of what's happening behind the faceplate of hardware, because it's so easy for us to get like really, really mystical about them. And actually just going in and, building a few different preamps and a few different compressors, you start to see, like you're saying, those similarities in certain kinds of circuits. And like, oh, these kind of have a few of those things at that point, and these have a few of those. And that's really interesting. So
yeah,
I think I mentioned about the Neve thing. Like I really like Rupert Neve's circuits. And there's a way that he designs stuff that sounds phenomenal.
Yeah.
And they've been, as boardroom politics have happened across the 80s and 90s or whatever, like that's moved around a lot, but we have access to that. And I guess like whatever you guys do in your headquarters, your code wizards, the way that they actually translate that, like that is some serious voodoo, but you can really sense like whatever the physics side of how things go through a chain and a flow, like certain things happen.
Yeah.
Which I no idea how the hell you do it in code, but
it's
you can really,
it's some mad science, but it is like the level of detail that they take when they're developing these plugins. Like it's the circuit modeling it's component by component, and it's retracing and recreating every element of the circuit, resistors, transformers, transistors, every element of it gets. There's a way to mathematically represent what it does, what it's supposed to do, but then also what it does, what it actually does. And so they're kind of always balancing between these things. Like, oh well, we know this transformer is supposed to have this sort of function to it, but then when we measure it, we actually get this when we push it this hard. So that, and that's kind of been, to me, that's always been my favorite thing about UAD plugins is like, it's not just like, okay, boosting at 10K, I'm boosting at 10K. It is like, on the real Neve, it's like, 9/8 and it's this different shape, but then we switch over to 12K, the shelf changes shape a little bit, like all those little details and nuances that aren't represented on the faceplates or aren't represented just in what you would assume it does. The plugins always follow what the actual hardware did.
Totally.
To a T.
And I have to say as well, like, once I got on to all of your guys' plugs in particular, I think I got on like around 2012, which was at the end of me hand building all my hardware.
Yeah.
Like I don't use any of that hardware at all. So it was
those poor babies.
It was a good side quest in the role-playing game of life, so to speak. But it served a great function for me in terms of being able to make good music now, which is like I really don't have any kind of like mystical mojo around hardware. I certainly recognize like what good hardware does. But then also like once computers got powerful enough and code got good enough to replicate a lot of these things that hadn't really been replicable before. And really I found like the world of color that I could access with these stuff really kind of accelerated. And I've been mixing in the box since before it was a term, like in the late 90s. And I had a number of times when we'd have a project and we would have gone to an outside mixer and they would have mixed it on a Neve, and then the mix wasn't quite right, and then I'd rebuild something in Pro Tools. And at that time, we had like lo-fi for distortion, and that was it. So it's not, there's always ways to make things sound good, but I'm just like really ecstatic about the actual range of cool things and cool colors that are available now, and kind of in a way how much more creative you can get. Oh,
totally. And that's it. We've got a whole box of coloring pencils nowadays, right? Like
totally. Yeah.
There's no shortage of it. But so that, it kind of brings me to a question. How do you pick when to go for a 1084 versus when to go for a 1073 or to go for an API EQ? Like what's, how does that kind of thought process work in your brain when you're looking at a track?
Well, if you're designing presets for the 1084, that's a really good indication that you might have a shot. But in general, I think like going back to what you were saying before, when you get a new tool, like how do you learn it?
Mm-hmm.
And actually like being able to do a whole bunch of these things where you make these extreme moves, you kind of almost have to imprint your senses with the feeling of what something does.
Yeah.
And then for me, when I'm mixing, it's like I really started noticing a few years ago. It's like I'd be kind of like opening up multi-tracks and going through sounds, and it's just like, oh, this needs a bit of that thing and this needs a bit of that thing. So it's really becoming familiar enough with it to have like for it to become instinct or second nature. So in a way, like when you get a new tool and first off, just like try it on everything.
Yep.
So you have to explore, and that's a little bit like if you're a musician and you're practicing your scales. So you get a new tool and you just kind of try and make it second nature, and then the little voice or the speakers will tell you what they want.
Yeah.
And then often as well, sometimes we're like trying a whole bunch of stuff and things don't quite work. And sometimes, that's, I guess the third option is like you're desperately just like trying to figure out stuff. There's also like the very straightforward like physics end of like, the API gain is like in 2 dB increments. So if you're just looking for like a very, very gentle lift in like your high mids, you're not going to go and put on like 2 dB of 7K.
Yep.
And then also if you hear like there's a big whistle frequency on something, then you're probably going to pull out like a modern digital EQ where you can do like a Q of 50 and cut, 18 dB. So yeah, I mean, there's a particular EQ I really like for kind of corrective stuff, and the way, I mean, this is a pretty simple multi-track, but I tend to have like my color things tend to be on the second half or the set, later in the chain. So it's like I'll do all kind of corrective things earlier.
Yeah.
So it's like there's some corrective stuff, some forgiving stuff, some control stuff, and then like I let the color things happen as well. So yeah, but it's trial and error, and then becoming second nature, really.
Yeah. Well, and I hope people don't sleep on your little point there of like how it's kind of like practicing scales, right? Like in theory, you kind of, to know audio tools, to know EQs and compressors and just any of these tools, like you do have to practice with them. Like you do have to kind of intellectualize and get it into your ears and cement into your brain like what these things sound like. And for a lot of us, like we've learned the 1073 over the years, and you get to know what that high end does, and you just know like there's certain tracks where you're like, oh, I want some high end, and which one has that smooth? Oh yeah, I want that 1073 high end because you've used it so many times that your brain is like, oh, this is the one to go for that. Versus every once in a while you're like, oh, like I kind of want to clean up the bottom and I need a little extra bite and compress. Oh, I'm gonna pull up the SSL channel for this one. Like you kind of. You had to be able to do like that sort of process of listen, identify, create a bit of a vision for yourself, and then start choosing your tools.
Yeah, around the time like there was the kind of year preceding when I went freelance, which was actually I went freelance just before my 21st birthday, which is a bit unusual. But I started watching like old kung fu films, as young men in their early 20s do. And basically everyone would have like a montage of a training scene.
Yeah.
And it's just like repetitive movements over and over, repetitive movements until it's second nature. Yep. And we won't go into the whole plot curve, but the end is that you beat the end of level, the big bad guy by instinctively performing your repetitive movements because they're part of who you are. So mixing or any kind of music production is no different. Like I really remember actually about, 6 months a year after I went freelance, I was very lucky that a project I was programming on got mixed by Spike Stent. I remember going in and, sitting in while he was mixing and watching him with like a cigarette in one hand, just going like that and like EQing, like looking the other way. And he's literally just like, and that was a channel. And then he go, just like we're all kind of chatting away, and you're just like, oh my god, like he wasn't sitting there going like, okay, what are we gonna do with this sound, and then putting it in solo and then like doing a little tweak, and it's just so we
just go
so all of this is like we just want this stuff to become instinctive and practice. Actually, can I tell you guys a fun story? I was mentioning my Twitch stream earlier. I did an interview yesterday with an artist called Atara Valentine. I actually produced an album for him on Atlantic in like 2009, which for one reason or another didn't come out. But literally last Friday, he put out his debut single.
Wow.
Pretty much a decade later. And there's all kinds of foibles. Like it's a 2-hour interview, which is amazing. And especially if you're making your own music and you haven't released stuff yet, like he's a brilliant person to go listen to. But he had to learn mixing as well. So he's like written, recorded, performed, produced, and mixed all his stuff. Then he's doing all the marketing. But he had this fascinating thing he said about mixing and learning to mix himself, which is that he said he just mixed the same song over and over and over and over again. And not like, he didn't keep working on the same mix for 3 months of like opening it up and tweaking it again. He said I'd get it to a certain point and then go, oh, like I made a whole ton of mistakes on there. I see what I did right. I see what I did wrong. And then he'd strip the entire thing back to just no automation, raw audio files. Then he'd try another mix, and he just did that over and over again. And it wasn't, I was kind of quite floored. I'd never heard of that concept.
Yeah.
So he wasn't like going and mixing a whole bunch of different songs trying to learn something different.
Mixing one song, multiple.
Yeah, but he said like, oh, then I'd like really start to understand what that particular compressor does in that particular situation, or So it's well worth checking that one out.
Man, that
inclined.
That's a whole thing. I don't know how that's never come up as like a way to practice, right?
I thought it was brilliant.
Yeah, it really
like,
is actually
genius concept, and I've never done that before. We've all gone in and tried to fix things that aren't quite right or whatever.
Exactly.
In that process.
Yeah.
But then it's also like, you're really focusing on like, what are you doing with your tools, and how does even like the way you put it together, the order you build a mix and all that kind of thing, how does that affect you?
Yeah. Oh man, that's I'm gonna take that in mind, because like a lot of times, like if I've had to mix a song 2 or 3 times, to me the feeling that you have personally, right, it's like, oh man, I messed this up 2 times, I'm trying to get it right each time, like artist isn't happy or I'm not happy with it. Like you think like it's a negative thing that forces you to start fresh again, as opposed to seeing it as like this. No, this is the way, a great way to learn. Like you don't learn the C major scale by trying it in all different keys. Like you learn, you play, totally, you keep it centered in one thing. You learn, if you're doing a guitar, you learn it in a position, and then you really try to master that one scale or that one position before you move on to the next one.
And if you make a mistake once, you don't go, well, I better like do the F sharp minor then or whatever. You kind of
exactly right.
Yeah. But it was so that was a really kind of profound insight, I thought, that he had there.
Oh yeah. And then, of course, especially if you do it with a song that you love and you have that positive approach to mixing and remixing, and you approach it from that learning mindset of like, I'm here to try something new today on this thing that I know better, like the back of my hand. I know what the raw tracks are. Now, how can I drive it to a different destination just by mixing? Yeah, that was wild. And I just remember also like earlier in my career, I still am very excited about mixing, but just like being so excited about like when I got to mix stuff, because then you'd know that you could bring out a different element, or reveal a different side, or there's something that's waiting to kind of come to life about a song. So since you've got your kind of foot in so many of these different worlds, how do you delineate your process at all between production and mixing, or are you kind of mixing all the time nowadays?
I definitely actually delineate. And I think I really kind of got meta about my process a few years ago, because I started noticing there's a few kind of friction points, or even things I was very reluctant to do, that kept happening over and over again. There's a whole, like if we wanted to have a 5-hour conversation, I could tell you that I actually spent about 3 years. I've been on Pro Tools since like 97, 98 or whatever, but I spent about 3 years literally trying every single DAW that was out there, thinking that there must be something where I can write a song, record a song, produce it, whether that be with like a full live band or just like one vocalist, do remixes, then be able to mix perfectly, and then like do additional programming in a mix, and then print stems. And I was chasing this dream. And it doesn't exist.
Nope.
But then I also realized that when you're trying to do that, what happens is that your mind starts to get a little bit hyper. And I really noticed that when I was writing, especially like once I moved to LA and I was doing like a ton more writing, and people write really fast. When I was based in Montreal, I was doing mostly remote mixing. And then when I was in the UK, it was like we were completely fine to spend 5 days finding a kick drum.
Yeah.
But the kind of writing scene now is like you need to be like fast. So I was noticing I'd get like an initial idea up, then I'd be like really, really hesitant to add to it. And I also noticed that if I was in a situation where I was doing additional production on a track, then I seemed to be like really hesitant to go and program drums.
Yeah.
So on like the drum side, I realized one day, it's like, oh my God, I have like 2 decades worth of kick drums.
Yeah.
And so like, and it was literally like this inner terror of like, I'm going to have to spend 5 days looking for a kick drum.
Yeah.
So I don't hesitate to say I'm like the Marie Kondo hipster. Like I read Marie Kondo before it was cool. So I applied that to the music making process. But the flip side as well is like, you'd also have 2 ideas. And then because I mix so often, my mix brain would be switched on.
Yeah.
And it's like, oh, well, if I just polish this and that. So there's a tendency to start thinking too early in the stage, what do I need to do to polish this up and make it sound like a record?
Mm-hmm.
So now I do all like my idea generation and kind of writing and messing around with music in Ableton Live.
Yep.
And I don't have any of my mix tools in there.
Oh, so it's just instrument.
It's like
purely...
instruments, samplers, a few creative plugins, you know, like I have DimD and Galaxy Space Echo and all that kind of stuff in there. But it's really like, oh, what else does this need? And I'll make a musical element to go in there.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Or I'll do a crazy kind of like bit of reprocessing. So it's very much like the old school days when you'd be in like a cheaper studio where you just know you're not mixing in there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Or you have like a mix. Yeah. So, but it's great because your mind is then focused on like what's cool ideas and you're thinking on like a much higher level, or like what can I do to this drum track to like get a broader interest and like get a bigger phrase happening? What can I do to these chords? How can we start to build out a structure straight away? And instead of being like, here's an initial idea, is it fat enough?
Yeah. Right.
You know what I mean?
You're asking the wrong question at that point in time.
Totally. And then, you know, when I export stuff then over into Pro Tools, then that means that the different brain for me comes on. And I do a ton of really creative stuff in Pro Tools, and I had years of like building tracks from the ground up in Pro Tools. So it's no diss either way. It's just I found for me, it's very useful to separate that. Then also, additionally, I have to say like the way, you know, our industry has gone is we don't have like 7-month lockouts anymore.
Yeah.
With an artist, like, you know, I did literally spend 7 months in a studio with a Prodigy in 2004, which was amazing. But we don't really have that luxury. So it tends to be if I'm working at like the recording phase with an artist, very often like one of us will have traveled. So there's like kind of a lot of overhead. So I tend to just treat those sessions as like really intense capture phases. It's just like get in as many ideas as possible.
Yep.
Then I'll need to take those away and then put on basically like my editor brain. Like kind of the coder brain, because I alluded to earlier about like the whole thing of like transients in your ears processing capability. And when you're trying to marry electronics and live performances, it's a bit like you've got, you know, an early Scorsese film on one side and then like a Pixar film on the other, and you can't just stick them over the top of each other because they don't gel.
Yeah.
So, you know, it's like you need to put a little bit of CGI on your Scorsese stuff and then like get the right texture on your electronics. But that basically means like it's a lot of like really in-depth, for me, going into like the individual waveforms and oscillations and sliding things around and locking things in so that they can combine in the right way. And when I do that, like my normal kind of outgoing nature has to like shut down, and it's also really boring for artists. So I try to, you know, say that once we've done this, you won't hear from me for a while. So I'm going to be on this phase. And that's also when like the label starts going, send us monitor mixes. And I'm like, no. Like this is open heart surgery right now. And everyone gets a little bit stressed out or whatever. But then for me, like once that's in place and I know the kind of physics of the performances can work with electronics, and I'll do like another programming phase or something like that. And then have a final mix. But it's really like, I have a whole task management system if we want to go there, but I have literal tags of like record, program, edit, mix. So, you know, so I can like open up an album and then say, okay, what do we need to edit? And then it'll just show all the songs and all the parts that need to be edited. Or, you know, if I have done the editing, but I know we still need to record something, I can look at all those things. But yeah, so the very clear different phases is really important. And I think that's really critical in this day and age as well, because, you know, it's, as we know, the big cliche is like, it's the time of infinite distraction. So just getting to a position where you're giving your brain less options tends to make your brain a lot more creative. And actually, can I come at that from a different end as well, which is like when I really started getting a ton of mix work, it took me a while to kind of shut up my producer programmer brain. I'd open up a multi-track and part of me would go like, well, I haven't done that. Oh, let's swap out the kick drums. And then straight away you start, you know, I haven't even started mixing and we're like swapping out kick drums or something like that. And actually I can't remember who it was. I think it might have been Manny American said in some interview once, it's like, well, I figure if something's there, it's there for a reason. So I never switch anything out. And I was like, brilliant. Let's do that. So I just like adopted it philosophically. Not saying it's right or wrong, but there's a certain amount of laziness. Like, okay, if you do that, then you don't have to spend a week looking for the right kick drum. And then it's like, how do we make what we've been presented as a mixer? How do you make that work? And even though like the first 80% might have been really difficult, then at some point you find the way that particular combination of stuff works. And it sounds phenomenal. You're like, oh my God, I would have never thought of building a record that way. And I do feel like I pride myself, like I don't really work with like straight down the middle kind of vanilla artists, if you know what I mean, or someone who's like solidly in the middle of a genre, or if I get pulled in by like a bigger bend or something like that, it's normally because I want me to add a bit of backspin to it.
Mm-hmm.
So I like stuff that's a bit weird and unusual and interesting. And I really love this era where artists can be self-produced and where they can really develop all of their own idiosyncrasies and their own weird things that I, as a producer, would never have thought of doing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Like it's
Mhm.
really cool. So, and that's also, you know, how we stand out in this day and age. So I feel like if anytime I got a multi-track, I just like shoved it through my kind of sausage factory and ground it up and reformed it,
Yeah.
that kind of defeats the purpose of why that artist has an identity to start with.
And
So
they've been working on that sound and those tracks and you know everything about it. You know they've been living with that potentially for years, right? Like they've been building
Yeah.
and working towards this thing. And then if you hear it for 5 minutes, you're like, I hate that kick drum. I'm gonna put my own in there.
Yeah.
It's you're just instantly departing from something that's been loved and cared for, and then you just are like, no, I'm gonna do my thing.
Yeah. So yeah, you got to get on the wavelength. I mean, the flip side is sometimes people come to me and they say like, "Hey, I've been working on this thing and I know it's not quite right or it's missing something. Do you think you could do that for me?"
Mm-hmm.
So that's a different situation. Do you know what I mean? And that kind of like permission, as it were, or that request from artists will let me do that. But then having had that different headspace of like, how can I always preserve what's unique about what the artist is doing?
Yeah.
Lets me think about it very much and like, what can we just where's like the little gap in the tiles where we just need to put a little bit of grout or something like that, rather than like, I will make it sound like Damian or something.
Well, it's always a fun creative challenge too as a mixer, right? Because then you're challenged, like, all right, wow, this kick feels like it's a mile away from what this needs to fit with the track. How can without just jumping in and replacing all the samples, how could I shape this sound and bring it closer to preserve what they have but bring it closer to my vision for it, and that's sometimes it pushes you to get more creative with how you process things, or
100%. Or almost a weird thing is like people will hear it and they go like, oh, that weird track where it sounds like the kick doesn't like relate to it at all, that's so cool.
Yeah.
It's like classic Prince records weren't made by like trying to sound like anything normal. Do you know what I mean? So it's like just like really like, imagine if someone had gone like, oh, we don't want that kind of key gate on the guitar on Kiss, something like that, then it was just like a strummy acoustic guitar instead of a crazy thing. So anyway, we gotta leave the door open and know when to leave on these kind of weird edges and stuff.
Absolutely. Well, man, Damian, this has been super fun. Kind of getting to geek out about the Neve and kind of learn a lot about your concept of how you're approaching this plugin, which truly, like, it is definitely the most unique, I think, out of all the presets I've seen for it, but also just the mindset and kind of the process that you're bringing to it. I think it's really cool to see how you're approaching it more as a color box than as a traditional EQ tool.
Nice.
So yeah, man, it's super inspiring both for me and everyone that's been here enjoying this conversation alongside us. Any other tips or tricks you want to leave the fine viewers with?
Oh my God, how much time do we have? Well, the first tip is, like, in all seriousness, follow me on the socials, because the stem thing I'm sure there's people out there who do it, but it will blow your mind if you haven't done it. So again, that's like Instagram /HereIsDamian with a DAMIAN, or I'm on Twitch every Monday, Wednesday, Friday.
Awesome.
Let me think. Is there like one immediate? You know what? My tip is going to be a philosophical one.
Great.
Which is going through all of these kind of questions we've been having of like, how do we approach different things? If it still sounds weird in a bad way, and you don't know why, just stop tweaking and take a break. All right, that's my pro tip for you. And like, once I started, actually, I remember when I was working with Björk, she would say a thing. She'd just go like, I've listened to this track enough for now. And just like very casually, and then like come back to it 2 weeks later. So in other words, like, your objectivity is the most critical, most important thing on there. So know when to stop, know when to take breaks, know when actually taking a 2-hour break will let you come back and in 10 minutes, like, make all the decisions that you need to with a fresh ear. So there you go. Philosophy tip for you.
Oh man, what a great note to end this on.
All right.
Well, Damian, thank you so much, man. Really appreciate it. It's been a really fun conversation, and thanks. You shared so much knowledge and tips here that there's a lot for people to chew on. But if you guys still are hungry for more, which I hope you are, we're gonna be back for another office hours this afternoon at 2 p.m. With Daryl Thorpe. We're gonna be kind of browsing through his presets, and we've got yet another complete left turn in terms of musical examples. So I'm really looking forward to this afternoon's session and conversation with Daryl. So everybody go grab a bite to eat, have some lunch, take a little break, and then we'll be back here in a couple of hours. And thanks again so much for tuning in. All right, see you guys.